Welcome to Rumor versus Truth, your trusted source for facts, where we dissect the evidence behind risky rumors and reveal clinical truths. Today, we'll dust off claims about expired medications.
Welcome, folks, and to start us off, Don, I heard you have a spicy story for us.
Yes, I do. So the impetus behind actually this topic we're talking about today, I was organizing my spice cabinet probably about 10 years too late. But when I was looking through, I found some not so great spices in there. Found a jar of chili powder that expired in 2014.
Oh,
And
gross.
yeah. And here's the thing, I've moved about 3 times since then. So this expired jar has made it through multiple moves with me. So it just wasn't diligent in kind of checking that thing out. So I went
That's
to throw them
impressive as
away.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I went to see, maybe it was still usable for some reason. Maybe it was my own parents kind of deal with me. They keep everything expired like parents normally do, but it came out in a giant block. So that spice I could say is no longer usable.
But you haven't answered the question, Don. Did you actually end up using it for your food? That's what we're all
Yeah, I did not
wondering.
answer that. No, I definitely did not.
Oh, thank goodness.
My food just went without spice that day.
That's good. That's probably a good move, Don. And
Yeah.
for our listeners here, I'm Steve, the pharmacist.
And I'm Don the pharmacist.
And in this episode, as you can guess it, we're looking at claims about expiration dates and whether age is just a number when it comes to medications.
Yeah. Questions about expirations they feel as old as time,
Yep.
and they're always popping up. And this is really no joke either. So expired medications actually cost a pretty penny. I was looking at some studies before this podcast, and I found that expired meds, there was one small study actually that expired meds costed one hospital over $200,000 just in 1 year alone. So you can imagine, take that number across how many pharmacies across the country, you're looking at millions of dollars just alone on expired medications.
Yeah, talk about time is money, Don. My goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get to the fun. We have our first claim here. And the claim is med expiration dates are more of a guess than a science. And I can kind of see where this claim is actually coming from. People in practice normally see these medications consistently have either 2 or 3 year expiration date from today. So they think, okay, are manufacturers just putting these numbers up there, or is there something a little more scientific to it? And so the answer is there's definitely something more scientific to it. So FDA regulations require that these drug applicants provide stability data testing on certain medications. And they put these medications through the rigmarole. So they put it in room temperature conditions and, elevated temperature, lower temperature, different humidity conditions as well. And they kind of test the product after certain periods of time, um, set intervals. And they test for these impurities that kind of come up with degraded medications. And when they find a certain point in that condition, whether it's room temperature, high humidity, normal humidity, whatever it may be, uh, if the impurity within the medication is above a certain level, that's the particular point where they set that expiration date for that medication. So 2 to 3 years tends to be kind of the average for it. 5 years tends to be the maximum that they give certain medications. Uh, and it is definitely not an arbitrary kind of thing. So looking back at the claim, med expiration dates are more a guess than science. The verdict is it's a rumor. As I stated, there's a pretty huge rigmarole that these manufacturers go through to test that stability of those medications before they put an expiration date on the product.
Yeah, that's quite a gauntlet for those meds, Don.
Mm,
And are there
right.
ever meds that don't have expiration dates? Does that ever happen?
Yeah, actually there is. And to the
Oh,
bane of, when you try to compound certain medications and you find that some don't have an expiration, what do you do? So one example that was seen with investigational drugs. And the reason why that is
yeah.
because they're investigating the use of that drug while the company's doing that expiration testing on that medication. So it's kind of going in tandem with it. But usually there's some kind of beyond use date that's attached to that protocol or to that investigational medication. So make sure you look at protocols to see what type of expiration you should be putting on there. And some OTCs actually don't have it either. Like I said earlier, with the bane of compounding, like certain ointments and creams may have an expiration date on them. Um, they usually don't have to do it because if it's been shown to be good after 3 years, then manufacturers don't really have to stamp that expiration on that particular product.
Interesting. Well,
Mhm.
the good news, folks, is that by and large, we don't have scientists throwing darts at dartboards for this
Nope,
to get
definitely
these
not.
dates. But then the question does become, Dawn, with this next claim, meds are no longer good after their expiration date, yes or no? And what I was able to find is technically almost everything does have an expiration date, especially if you want to get philosophical about it, right? And it does depend
Mhm.
on the drug, inactive ingredients, how they're made, and also, pretty importantly, how we're storing them. I know of some meds where you have to keep them in the manufacturer bottle. You can't take them out because they're such divas. You got to protect them from light or moisture, and they're just so sensitive to the environment. I was able to find a really cool study from 2019 that looked at antique or like relic meds, really old meds, to test their potency. For example, I found one where they mentioned a 53-year-old furosemide injection vial, so a diuretic, and still had 99% of its original potency. So I was actually pretty impressed by that. But on the flip side, they had an amphetamine 5 milligram tablet that lost 56% of its strength after 28 to 40 years. So it depends on the drug here. And also, what's interesting is that the US government actually does expiration date extensions based on stability studies, specifically for stockpiled meds that we keep for emergencies. And when they tested some of those meds, they found out that many could be extended 3 to 4 fold for their expiration dates. And that's quite a bit. But again, there were exceptions like albuterol inhalers. They couldn't give an extension because of their questionable results. But on the flip side, codeine tablets had an expiration date that was extended by over 7 years. And what's more, it depends on the lot and batches, even of the same med. For example, cephalexin capsules, an antibiotic, certain lots were extended by 28 months, whereas others were extended by over 100 months, depending on which
Oh,
one you're talking about. So not all meds are made alike. And overall, the author said that solid dosage forms tend to be more stable than injectable meds. And that makes sense to me, right? Injectable meds are more complex. They have a lot more ingredients like buffers, and you got to keep those things sterile. So, when it comes to this claim, whether medications are no longer good after their expiration date, the verdict is true, but with conditions. Like we saw, although many meds are likely still usable after their expiration date, that degradation we saw is way too variable, even for the same med, to know for sure. And I would say that is not worth the risk, especially if we're talking about meds done that rely on exact dosing. I'm thinking things like anti seizure meds or insulin, right?
yeah, definitely. And Steve, you did mention relic, so I'm really curious since you were doing the research. What was the oldest relic med that you found?
So get this, they had a vial of epinephrine injection from 1934, and it actually had 70% of its potency still intact. And just to keep in mind, folks, the FDA wasn't established until 1938. So that is one old vial of epinephrine. And even though it was
Mhm.
70%, I wouldn't want to use that.
No, no, definitely not. Yeah, it's interesting. Uh, yeah, so let's go ahead and move on to our next claim here. And the claim actually is certain medications can become toxic after the expiration date. And
Mm,
it's a good segue from your topic, Steve, because
yeah, definitely.
a patient may ask, going off what you said, okay, well, it's no longer good, yes or no. Is it going to hurt me if I
Yeah,
take this medication?
good
If,
point.
I can deal with the 5%, 10% lack of potency, but am I going to get hurt from this?
Hmm.
Uh, for solid forms of medications, this isn't really true about being harmful. We did mention our last tetracycline podcast that there was that classic case of tetracycline causing the Fanconi syndrome, which is that kidney disease. Uh, but that doesn't really apply today because tetracycline has been reformulated. So that's pretty much true of solid medications. They're not really toxic. Again, we don't want to recommend taking expired medications, but toxicity is not really seen there. When it comes to liquid medications or medications that preservatives, that could become a different story. This is a review of preservatives. What's their design? The design is to actually prevent that microbial growth that happens in medications. Um, But when you're looking at where these medications go, when the preservative actually no longer works to prevent that microbial growth, then it becomes an issue. So there were some cases actually showing where eye drops were used past their expiration date, and it was causing eye irritation, redness, um, in those particular cases because there was bacterial growth actually in that eye drop because they were expired. I'm thinking of another case as well where thinking of hospital examples of medications where bacteria just love. So propofol
Mhm.
is actually one of them, right? Where it's a
Yeah,
lipid
true.
emulsion. Bacteria just love to be in there and grow in there. And that if you're thinking about, well, if you're injecting these medications, you're bypassing the body's natural defense towards bacteria, and you're putting it right in the person's veins. So that could definitely be an issue if you're injecting medications that have that microbial growth added to them. And that's all to recap on that. It's also important why when in the hospital, pharmacy, whatever it may be, to put those beyond use dates and expiration dates on those medications so people know not to use those particular medications after a certain
Absolutely.
time.
That's key.
Yeah. So looking back at the claim, certain meds can be toxic after their expiration date. The verdict is true with conditions. Like I said, solid forms not really shown to be toxic past expiration date, but the bets are off when it comes to liquid medications that have preservatives, that could be injected into the body.
Yeah, and Don, that made me think of a recent news item. I believe benzoyl peroxide, the
Mm,
acne topical creams and ointments, those are
mm,
currently a concern, right? Because expired versions of them might break down into carcinogenic benzene. And I believe they're even saying throw out any expired benzoyl peroxide. And perhaps if you have some that isn't expired, make sure you keep that
mm.
according to their storage conditions. So, kind of a current events example there,
Yep.
but
Yep.
scary
Good
stuff,
ad
Don.
there. Yeah. Yep.
But what do you do if you have a med that isn't toxic after it expires? Can those expiration dates ever be extended, or is it just set in stone?
Mm,
That's our next claim. Can expiration dates on meds ever be extended? Technically, medications after their labeled expiration date do become unapproved drugs per FDA, which is a big no no out in the pharmacy world. But I was able to find a couple different routes that exist for different meds to have their extension for the expiration date. And it's usually reserved for emergency situations. And in fact, we already talked about two of them. One was the route you mentioned, where manufacturers can redo their testing and submit that testing to the FDA. But
mm,
as you can guess, that takes a lot of paperwork and a lot of time, which probably most companies aren't willing to do. And then I also mentioned the US government program earlier where we test supplies in our national stockpiles to see if we can extend that dating. That's known as the Shelf Life Extension Program, or SLEP, that tests that. And again, that's only for stockpiled emergency meds. The other two routes I found were interesting. The Secretary of Health and Human Services for the US and the FDA can issue an emergency use authorization to change expiration dates. We kind of saw that with COVID, right? And the FDA
mm,
can also do the same for meds that are officially on shortages in case we need to do that. And then the last route I found pretty hilarious is that the FDA can simply choose not to enforce expiration dating rules if
mm.
they didn't want to. So I don't think they take that route very much, but it does
ML.
exist. It could also be a pretty bold move. But with that,
Mm.
this claim that expiration dates on meds can be extended, the verdict is true, but with conditions. Really, as we saw before, this only applies to critical meds. It's really unlikely to see this process done for chronic or non emergency meds like statins or high blood pressure meds. And the FDA has a list of these medications on their website. But keep in mind, folks, it's certain NDCs or national drug codes of certain meds. Not all of a certain med is going to be approved for this. And it also even depends on the lot or batch numbers for a specific med. So it's all over the place. And in addition, the FDA can also dictate additional requirements for things like new storage or labeling standards when they end up doing this. So there are stipulations to doing this as well. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And looking back at our claims, it seems like expired medications risks outweigh their potential benefits, and it seems like clinical judgment is really important here.
Hmm.
So expired medications live on borrowed time, even though we say that they're past their prime.
Right, Don. It makes me think of a scenario here. If you and I are on like a desert island and all we have is an expired EpiPen and I go into anaphylaxis, are you not going to use it on me and just let me die? Like, what would you do here?
I would use the 1934 relic epinephrine vial that you mentioned earlier.
And you know what? I wouldn't blame you
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
And you can say the same thing for things like naloxone for opioid overdose. When we're talking about life-threatening issues here, there are rare circumstances where maybe using expired med may make sense. But on the flip side, meds lying around do increase the risk of accidental or intentional overdose, right? And probably now's a good time, Don, to advocate for how to properly dispose of expired meds. One example I can think of is DEA has drug take-back days every April and October each year. And they also have year-round drop-off locations you can find on their website.
And also, some pharmacies do have those special disposal receptacles in there, and they also have those mailback programs. So just ask pharmacy staff for them.
Yeah, they're a great resource. And the FDA also has resources too at fda.gov/drug disposal. They have tips on different meds. Not every med is disposed the same way. So check that out for different nuances there. And our website also has a great technician tutorial entitled Medication Disposal in the Hospital for all you hospital folks out there. We didn't forget you.
Thanks for mentioning that tech tutorial because that's a great resource.
Yep, for sure.
So a couple more things here. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, rate, and review Rumor versus Truth where you get your podcasts. Those ratings and reviews really help others find us. You can also help our show grow by telling a friend about the awesome things you learned and where you found us. Believe it or not, Steve, we're actually 4 episodes in, and we already covered juicy interactions, hangover remedies, and tetracyclines in previous shows.
Yeah, and they're great episodes, friends. So, speaking of helpful things, we've packed our show notes with resources, including a link to Pharmacist letter, Pharmacy Technician's letter, and Prescriber Insights, where you'll find our upcoming article in our May 2025 issue on this topic. Plus, we've linked our chart on meds that need to be stored in their original containers.
If you're not already a TRC Healthcare subscriber, you're missing out on our industry-leading evidence-based tools in continuing education. Head over to our trchealthcare.com to learn more about our unbiased clinical resources.
And we really want to hear from you. Got a rumor you'd like us to investigate?
Yeah, it's really super easy to reach us. Just text us right from the show's notes using the Contact Us link at the bottom of your TRC Healthcare or letter homepage. You've got some burning and spicy questions for us waiting to be demystified.
Yep, and join us next time where we'll decipher what's the deal with dyes.
Okay. Thanks for listening to Rumor versus Truth, your trusted source for facts, where we dissect the evidence behind risky rumors and reveal clinical truths. See y'all next time.